Jamal Williams had just paid for his groceries when a security guard's hand grabbed his arm. "I need to check your bags," the man said, his voice cold with accusation. Jamal reached for his receipt to prove his innocence. 3 minutes later, he was dead on the floor, and the security guard walked away without looking back. But what that killer didn't know was that the judge who would decide his fate had buried her own son under similar circumstances 10 years earlier. The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse flickered overhead as Robert Harrison walked into courtroom 4A with the confident stride of a man who believed the system was on his side. At 48 years old, with graying hair cut military short and a physique maintained through years of aggressive gym routines, Bob Harrison carried himself like someone accustomed to authority, to being obeyed without question. The orange jumpsuit he wore did nothing to diminish his swagger. His court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named Sarah Mills, who had already lost sleep over this impossible case, walked beside him with her shoulders hunched under the weight of evidence she couldn't refute and a client she couldn't control. The gallery was packed with spectators, journalists, and members of Jamal Williams's family, their grief still raw 4 months after his death. But Bob Harrison didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their pain. His eyes swept the courtroom with the assessing gaze of someone cataloging exits and threats, old police habits dying hard. He had no idea that the judge presiding over his case would be the one person in that building who understood exactly what he had taken from this community because she had lost the same thing herself. The incident that had brought them all to this moment had occurred on a humid Tuesday evening in late July at a Save Mart supermarket on the east side of Detroit. Jamal Williams, a 23-year-old medical student home for summer break, had stopped at the store after a long shift at the community health clinic where he volunteered. He was tired, looking forward to getting home, maybe watching a game with his younger brother, enjoying the simple pleasure of being back in his childhood neighborhood. He had grabbed a basket and was making his way through the aisles, picking up items for his mother, milk and bread and the specific brand of hot sauce she liked, completely unaware that he was being watched, that his every movement was being interpreted through a lens of suspicion and prejudice by someone who had spent his entire career seeing threats where none existed. Robert Harrison had been working as a security guard at Save Mart for 3 years, ever since he had been forced out of the Detroit Police Department following his third excessive force complaint. The official record said he had resigned voluntarily, but everyone who knew the truth understood that he had been given a choice: leave quietly or face an internal investigation that would have ended his career in disgrace and possibly criminal charges. Bob had chosen to leave, but he had never stopped thinking of himself as a cop, never stopped carrying that sense of authority and power that came with a badge, even though his badge now was just a cheap plastic thing pinned to a blue uniform shirt with "security" stitched across the back. He patrolled the store like it was his beat, watching customers with the suspicious eye of someone who believed that his job was to catch criminals, not to help shoppers. And on this particular evening, when he saw a young black man in a hoodie moving through the store with a basket, something in his brain made a connection, a pattern he had been trained to see, and he decided that Jamal Williams was a threat. Jamal had been in the cereal aisle comparing prices on 2 boxes when he first noticed the security guard watching him. He looked up, made brief eye contact, then went back to shopping, thinking nothing of it. He was used to being watched in stores, had experienced that particular indignity so many times throughout his life that he had developed a kind of resigned acceptance of it. It was exhausting, being constantly suspected of crimes you had no intention of committing, but it was also just another part of being a young black man in America, another tax you paid for existing in spaces where people had been taught to fear you. He put the cereal in his basket, moved to the next aisle, grabbed a jar of peanut butter. Behind him, maybe 20 feet back, Bob Harrison followed, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt, his eyes never leaving Jamal's form. The store's security cameras would later show what happened next with perfect clarity, footage that would be played and replayed in courtrooms and on news broadcasts, images that would haunt everyone who watched them. Jamal had finished shopping and moved to the checkout line, setting his basket on the counter, pulling out his wallet. He had exact change, counted it out carefully, always conscious of not wanting to hold up the line or draw attention to himself. The cashier, a middle-aged woman who had worked at Save Mart for 15 years, rang up his items with practiced efficiency, bagged them, handed him his receipt. "Have a good night, honey," she said with a smile, and Jamal smiled back, thanked her, picked up his bags. It was a perfectly ordinary transaction, witnessed by cameras and by other customers in line, and a simple exchange of money for goods that should have ended with Jamal walking out the door and going home to his family. But Bob Harrison, who had been watching the entire interaction from his position near the store's entrance, had convinced himself that he had seen something. Maybe it was the way Jamal's hand had moved toward his pocket. Maybe it was the way he had glanced around before approaching the register. Maybe it was nothing more than the color of his skin and the prejudices that had been baked into Bob's worldview over decades of policing. Whatever the reason, Bob decided that Jamal Williams was a shoplifter, that he had concealed merchandise, that he needed to be stopped. And when Jamal walked toward the exit, his bags in hand, his receipt in his pocket, Bob Harrison stepped in front of him, blocking his path with his body, his hand held up in a stop gesture that was both a command and a threat. "Hold on there," Bob said, his voice carrying the tone of authority he had used thousands of times before, the voice that expected immediate compliance. "I need to check your bags." Jamal, startled by the sudden confrontation, stopped, looked at the security guard with confusion. "Check my bags? I just paid for everything. Here's my receipt." He reached into his pocket to pull out the paper, a simple motion, but Bob Harrison saw it differently. In that split second, his training and his prejudices and his paranoia all collided, and he interpreted Jamal's reach as a threat, as a possible weapon draw, and his hand moved to his belt where a canister of pepper spray was holstered. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Bob shouted, his voice suddenly loud, aggressive, drawing the attention of everyone in the store entrance area. Other shoppers turned to look, their conversations stopping, their faces showing confusion and concern. Jamal, now alarmed by the sudden escalation, raised his hands, the receipt clutched in one, his shopping bags in the other. "Man, I'm just showing you my receipt. I paid for everything. You can ask the cashier." His voice was calm but edged with the fear that comes from recognizing a dangerous situation, from understanding on some instinctive level that this encounter could spiral out of control. He had been taught since childhood about how to interact with authority figures, how to keep his hands visible, how to speak respectfully, how to not make sudden movements, all the survival strategies that black parents pass down to their children because the alternative could be fatal. But Bob Harrison was not interested in receipts or cashiers or de-escalation. He was locked into a narrative he had constructed in his mind, and nothing Jamal said would change it. "I said I need to check your bags," Bob repeated, stepping closer, his body language aggressive, invasive. "You've been acting suspicious since you came in here. Now put the bags down and step back." The accusation, delivered in front of other customers, was humiliating and enraging in equal measure. Jamal felt his face grow hot, felt the familiar burn of injustice that came from being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. "I haven't done anything," he said, his voice rising slightly, frustration breaking through his attempt to remain calm. "I'm a customer. I paid for my stuff. You can't just accuse people like this." His words were reasonable, his anger justified, but to Bob Harrison they were defiance, resistance, proof that his suspicions had been correct. The situation was a powder keg, and both men were holding matches. What happened next unfolded with terrible speed, captured from multiple angles by the store's security system. Bob Harrison grabbed Jamal's arm, attempting to physically detain him, and Jamal, acting on instinct and the fundamental human right to not be unlawfully touched, pulled away. "Don't touch me," he said loudly, backing up, his bags falling to the floor, cans and boxes spilling across the linoleum. Other shoppers were now actively watching, some pulling out phones to record, sensing that something very wrong was happening. Bob, enraged by what he perceived as resistance, lunged forward and grabbed Jamal again, this time with both hands, trying to force him to the ground. Jamal, younger and taller but not trained in combat techniques, struggled against the grip, trying to break free, not fighting back, but simply trying to escape an unlawful detention. "Let go of me!" "I didn't do anything." His voice was desperate now, afraid, the voice of someone who understood that this situation was spiraling toward violence. Bob Harrison, falling back on decades of police training and the muscle memory of subduing suspects, managed to get behind Jamal and wrapped his arm around the young man's neck, applying pressure in what was supposed to be a control hold, but what rapidly became something far more dangerous. Jamal's hands went to the arm around his throat, trying to pull it away, trying to breathe, his body going into panic mode as oxygen was cut off. "I can't breathe," he gasped, the same words that had been uttered by so many others before him, words that should have been a warning, a reason to stop, but that Bob Harrison either didn't hear or didn't care about. For Bob, this was what police work looked like. This was how you controlled a suspect who was resisting. And the fact that there was no crime, no justification, no legal basis for any of this, simply didn't register in his mind. The entire struggle lasted less than 3 minutes, but for Jamal Williams, it must have felt like an eternity. Witnesses would later testify to the horror of watching a young man's life being squeezed out of him in the entrance of a grocery store while other shoppers screamed for the security guard to stop, while someone called 911, while the world watched and recorded and did nothing that could save him. Jamal's struggles grew weaker, his gasps more desperate, his hands clawing less effectively at the arm around his throat. Bob Harrison, committed to the hold, convinced that if he just maintained pressure, the subject would eventually comply, didn't release his grip even as Jamal's body went limp, even as the young man's legs gave out and his full weight hung from Bob's arm, even as people screamed that he was killing him. It wasn't until Jamal Williams had been completely still for nearly 30 seconds that Bob finally let go, letting the body drop to the floor like a discarded piece of trash. The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, but it was already too late. They performed CPR, tried to restart Jamal's heart, loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to Detroit Medical Center. But he was pronounced dead 90 minutes later, his brain deprived of oxygen for too long, his young body broken by violence that should never have happened. The official cause of death would be listed as asphyxiation due to neck compression, clinical language that could never capture the magnitude of what had been lost. Jamal Williams had been 3 semesters away from earning his medical degree. He had volunteered at free clinics, tutored younger students, dreamed of opening a practice in underserved communities. He had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. And he had died buying groceries, killed by a man who believed that his suspicions justified murder. Bob Harrison was arrested at the scene, handcuffed by the same police officers who had once been his colleagues, who now looked at him with a mixture of recognition and disgust. During the initial interrogation, Bob showed no remorse, no understanding that he had done anything wrong. The suspect was resisting, he told the detectives, using the language of police reports, the passive voice that removed his agency from the violence. I used appropriate force to control the situation. When the detectives pointed out that there had been no crime, that Jamal had paid for his groceries, that witnesses and video clearly showed an unlawful detention and excessive force, Bob simply shook his head. "You weren't there. You don't know what I saw. That kid was suspicious, and I did what I had to do." His certainty was unshakable, his belief in his own righteousness absolute, even as the evidence piled up against him like stones on a grave. The case became national news within hours, another entry in the tragic catalog of black lives ended by those who were supposed to protect and serve. Jamal's name trended on social media, his graduation photo appeared on news broadcasts. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding justice. His mother, Diane Williams, became the face of that grief, standing at press conferences with dignity despite her devastation, speaking about her son not as a victim, but as a whole person with dreams and talents and a future that had been stolen. She spoke about how she had taught Jamal to be respectful to authority, to keep his hands visible, to not make sudden movements, how she had done everything a mother could do to keep her child safe in a world that saw him as a threat. And she spoke about how none of it had mattered, how all her caution and all his compliance had not saved him from a man who had decided he was guilty of existing while black. The prosecutor assigned to the case was James Chen, a methodical attorney known for his careful preparation and his commitment to justice. He knew that prosecuting a former police officer would be difficult, that the juries were often predisposed to give law enforcement the benefit of the doubt, that the defense would argue self-defense and reasonable fear in split-second decisions. But he also knew that this case was different, that the video evidence was irrefutable, that there had been no crime and no justification and no legal basis for what Bob Harrison had done. Chen charged him with second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter, counts that reflected both the intentional nature of the violence and the reckless disregard for human life. It was a strong case, perhaps the strongest Chen had ever prosecuted, but he also knew that convicting Bob Harrison was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring that the sentence reflected the magnitude of the crime, that justice was not just symbolic, but real. The trial was assigned to Judge Monica Carter, a decision that would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Judge Carter was a well-respected figure in the Detroit legal community, known for her fairness, her intelligence, and her no-nonsense approach to courtroom proceedings. She had been on the bench for 18 years, presiding over hundreds of cases with a reputation for being tough but fair, demanding but just. She was also a black woman, a mother, and someone who carried a grief that she had learned to transform into purpose. 10 years earlier, her own son, Marcus, had been killed during a traffic stop, shot by a police officer who claimed he had reached for something that turned out to be a cell phone. The officer had been cleared of wrongdoing, the shooting ruled justified, and Monica Carter had been left with a hole in her heart that would never heal. She had channeled that pain into her work, becoming an advocate for judicial reform, for accountability, for a justice system that actually delivered justice. And now, fate or providence or simple random assignment had put her in a position to preside over a case that was, in many ways, an echo of her own tragedy. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in October, the kind of day when the sky seemed to press down on the city with the weight of accumulated sorrow. Courtroom 4A was filled to capacity, every seat taken, people standing along the walls, reporters with notebooks ready, sketch artists positioned to capture the drama that everyone knew would unfold. The atmosphere was electric with tension, grief, and anger, emotions that had been building in the community for months since Jamal Williams's death. At the prosecution table, James Chen sat surrounded by his team, organized files and evidence boxes stacked precisely. Across the aisle, Sarah Mills sat with her client, Bob Harrison, who had refused her advice to wear a suit and instead appeared in a pressed button-down shirt that barely contained his muscular frame, his posture radiating defiance rather than remorse. He surveyed the courtroom with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating threats, his jaw set, his eyes cold. When Judge Monica Carter entered through the door behind the bench, the bailiff's call of "all rise" brought everyone to their feet in a wave of rustling movement. Judge Carter moved to her seat with quiet dignity, her black robes flowing behind her, her expression composed and professional. She was a woman of average height but commanding presence, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. As she settled into her chair and arranged her materials, she looked out over the courtroom with eyes that had seen too much pain, that carried the weight of personal loss, but that also blazed with an unwavering commitment to justice. She acknowledged the attorneys with a brief nod, then her gaze moved to the defendant, and for just a moment, something flickered in her expression before her professional mask settled back into place. Bob Harrison met her gaze with his own, and a slight smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a micro-expression of contempt that several observers in the gallery noticed. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and then she looked away, calling the court to order with 3 sharp strikes of her gavel that echoed like gunshots in the tense silence. James Chen's opening statement was a masterpiece of prosecutorial storytelling, weaving together the facts of the case with the emotional truth of Jamal Williams's stolen future. He spoke directly to the jury, his voice steady and clear, describing Jamal not as a statistic, but as a young man full of promise. He showed them photographs of Jamal in his white coat at the clinic, with his arm around his younger brother, at his college graduation with his proud mother beside him. He painted a picture of a life lived with purpose and kindness, a future that included healing others and contributing to his community. Then Chen's tone shifted, becoming harder, more clinical, as he described the events of that July evening. He walked the jury through the timeline minute by minute using diagrams and still frames from the security footage to show how an ordinary shopping trip had been transformed into a death sentence by one man's prejudice and violence. "The defendant will tell you he was doing his job," Chen said, his voice rising with controlled anger. "But the evidence will show you that Jamal Williams did nothing wrong. He paid for his groceries, he had his receipt, he was going home to his family. And this man killed him for no reason other than the color of his skin and his own inflated sense of authority." Sarah Mills's opening statement was an exercise in damage control, an attempt to humanize the indefensible. She did not claim that Bob Harrison was innocent of causing Jamal's death. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, she tried to frame it as a tragic mistake born of years of police training and genuine fear. She spoke about Bob's career in law enforcement, his years of service protecting the community, describing him as a man trained to see threats, to act decisively in dangerous situations. She argued that in the chaotic moments of that confrontation, Bob had made a split-second decision based on what he perceived as a threat, that he had not intended to kill anyone. Her voice was earnest, almost pleading, as she asked the jury to see her client as a flawed human being rather than a monster. It was a competent performance, delivered with genuine emotion. But even as she spoke, Bob Harrison sat beside her with an expression that undermined every word. He was not a man racked with guilt. He was a man who believed he had done nothing wrong, and his body language broadcast that conviction to everyone watching. The prosecution's case unfolded over 12 days, a carefully constructed narrative built from video evidence, forensic testimony, and heartbreaking accounts of witnesses. The store manager testified about Bob Harrison's history of complaints from customers, his pattern of targeting young black shoppers, his aggressive approach to security work. The cashier who had rung up Jamal's groceries testified that the transaction had been completely normal, that Jamal had been polite and had paid for everything. Multiple shoppers who had witnessed the confrontation took the stand, their voices shaking as they described watching Jamal plead for his life, watching the security guard maintain his chokehold long after it was clear the young man was in distress, watching a preventable death unfold in front of them. The medical examiner provided clinical testimony about the cause of death, explaining how prolonged pressure to the neck had cut off blood flow to the brain, how Jamal had experienced the terror of suffocation before dying. Each piece of testimony was another weight added to the scale of justice, but the most damning evidence was the security footage itself. When the prosecution played the full video of the incident on the courtroom's large screens, a heavy silence fell over the gallery. The footage was clear, showing every moment from multiple angles. They watched Jamal pay for his groceries, thank the cashier, and head toward the exit. They watched Bob Harrison intercept him, saw the confusion on Jamal's face, saw him reach for his receipt. They watched the confrontation escalate, watched Bob grab Jamal, watched the young man try to pull away. And then they watched, in horrible detail, as Bob wrapped his arm around Jamal's neck and held on, while Jamal struggled, while his hands clawed at the arm, choking him, while his movements became weaker, while other shoppers screamed in the background, while nearly 3 minutes passed and Bob never let go. The footage was objective, unflinching, impossible to misinterpret. It showed exactly what had happened, and what it showed was murder. Several jurors were visibly crying by the time the video ended. Members of Jamal's family had left the courtroom, unable to watch. But Bob Harrison sat at the defense table with his arms crossed, his face impassive, watching his own actions on the screen with what appeared to be critical detachment, as if reviewing tactical footage rather than watching himself take a human life. Throughout the trial, Bob Harrison's behavior was increasingly disturbing. He showed no emotion during testimony about Jamal's promising future. He appeared bored during the medical examiner's descriptions. When Diane Williams, Jamal's mother, took the stand to deliver her victim impact statement, speaking through tears about her son's kindness and the unbearable pain of losing him, Bob Harrison looked away, examined his fingernails, shifted in his seat with obvious impatience. His behavior was so callous, so devoid of basic human empathy, that it became a story in itself. Sarah Mills tried repeatedly to coach him, begging him to show some remorse, to appear somber and regretful, to at least pretend he understood the gravity of what he had done. But Bob was incapable of pretending. In his worldview, he was the real victim, persecuted for doing his job. He genuinely believed he would be acquitted, that his years of experience would count for something. His attorney knew better, could see the disgust in the juror's eyes, but she was powerless to save a client determined to destroy himself. The defense's case was brief and ultimately futile. Sarah Mills called a use-of-force expert who testified that neck restraints were common in law enforcement, but under cross-examination was forced to admit that maintaining pressure for nearly 3 minutes was excessive and dangerous, and that Bob Harrison had no legal authority to detain anyone. Mills called a psychologist who testified about the hypervigilance that comes from years in law enforcement, but Chen dismantled the testimony by pointing out that there had been no threat, no weapon, no crime, nothing that would justify even stopping Jamal Williams. The defense's attempts to explain away the inexplicable only served to highlight how baseless Bob's actions had been. Throughout it all, Bob Harrison sat with visible contempt for the proceedings, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath, behavior that Judge Carter had to address multiple times with increasingly stern warnings. The confrontation everyone had been waiting for came during the defense's character witnesses. A former police officer testified about Bob's career, but under cross-examination reluctantly admitted that Bob had a reputation for being physical, that he had been the subject of multiple excessive force complaints. As this damaging testimony unfolded, Bob's composure finally cracked. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly, and shouted, "That's bullshit! I was a good cop." Judge Carter's gavel came down like thunder. "Mr. Harrison, you will sit down and be silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Bob turned to look at Judge Carter with direct engagement, and what came out of his mouth next would define the rest of the trial. "Oh, I see how this is," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I should have known I wouldn't get a fair trial with you on the bench." He let his eyes travel deliberately over Judge Carter's face, making sure everyone understood his meaning. "This whole thing is rigged. You've already decided I'm guilty because of who I am and who you are." The racist implication hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah Mills grabbed her client's arm, her face pale with horror. The bailiffs moved forward, but Judge Carter sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the bench, her expression calm, though her eyes blazed with intensity. "Mr. Harrison, you will sit down now, or you will be held in contempt and removed." Bob laughed, an ugly sound. "Contempt? Yeah, that's about right. You think I don't see what's happening here?" Judge Carter's expression did not change. "Bailiffs, remove the defendant." As the officers grabbed his arms, Bob turned back to shout one final accusation. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning with their verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, none of them looked at Bob Harrison. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a clear, firm voice. "In the matter of the state of Michigan versus Robert Harrison on the count of second-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A sound like a collective exhale moved through the courtroom. Diane Williams collapsed into the arms of her family, sobbing. James Chen closed his eyes briefly in gratitude, and Bob Harrison sat frozen, his face suddenly pale, the reality of his conviction finally breaking through his armor of denial. Judge Carter thanked the jury, set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later, and dismissed them. As Bob was led from the courtroom, he turned back one last time to look at the judge, and his expression was pure hatred. The sentencing hearing arrived on a cold November morning. The courtroom was packed once again for the final act of this tragedy. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Carter invited victim impact statements, and Diane Williams approached the podium with photographs of her son clutched in her hands. She spoke about Jamal's dreams, his kindness, the hole in her family that would never be filled. She described the night she received the call that every parent fears, the moment she understood her son was gone. Her voice broke repeatedly, but she pushed through. When she finished, she looked directly at Bob Harrison and said, "I forgive you, because my faith commands me to forgive. But forgiveness does not mean there are no consequences. My son deserves justice." Then she returned to her seat, her head high, despite her tears, her dignity intact. Judge Carter allowed a moment of silence, and then She began to speak, and everyone in the courtroom leaned forward to hear the words they had been waiting for. "Mr. Harrison, I've been a judge for 18 years. I've presided over hundreds of cases, but I have rarely encountered a defendant who has shown such complete absence of remorse, such total inability to acknowledge wrongdoing." She paused, letting her words settle. "Throughout this trial, you have sat in my courtroom with contempt on your face. You have rolled your eyes during testimony. You have shown boredom during descriptions of how Jamal Williams died. You have treated these proceedings not as a reckoning for your actions, but as an inconvenience." Her gaze was unwavering. "You killed an innocent young man, Mr. Harrison. You accused him of a crime he did not commit. You put your hands on him without authority or justification, and when he tried to defend himself, you choked the life out of him while he begged you to stop, while witnesses screamed at you to stop, and you did not stop. You held on until he was dead." Judge Carter's voice grew stronger, filling every corner of the courtroom. "You have tried to justify your actions by claiming you were doing your job, by claiming you feared for your safety, but the evidence shows something different. The evidence shows that you targeted Jamal Williams because you saw a young black man and your prejudices told you he was a criminal. The evidence shows that you escalated a situation that required no intervention. The evidence shows that you used lethal force against an unarmed person who posed no threat." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping but becoming more powerful. "You suggested during this trial that I could not be fair because of my race, that this court was biased against you. Let me address that directly, Mr. Harrison. You are absolutely right that I understand this case in ways that perhaps others might not because of bias, but because of experience." For the first time, Judge Carter allowed a glimpse of her personal pain to show through. 10 years ago, my son Marcus was killed during a traffic stop. He was 26 years old, a graduate student, a gentle soul. A police officer pulled him over for a broken taillight, and when Marcus reached for his wallet, the officer shot him. The officer claimed he thought Marcus was reaching for a weapon. There was no weapon, just a wallet. The officer who killed my son was never charged. The shooting was ruled justified. I was told it was a tragic mistake, that the officer had feared for his life, and I had to live with that. I had to wake up every day knowing that my son's killer walked free, that there was no justice for Marcus. She paused, her jaw tightening. "So yes, Mr. Harrison, I understand this case. I understand what it means when someone uses fear as an excuse for murder. And I understand what real accountability looks like because I never got it for my son." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Bob Harrison, for the first time, looked uncertain, his earlier bravado cracking. Judge Carter straightened, her professional demeanor settling back into place. "But here is what you need to understand. I will not sentence you because of my personal pain. I will not sentence you because of the color of your skin or mine. I will sentence you based on the law, based on the evidence, based on the severity of your crime and the complete absence of mitigating factors. I will sentence you because you murdered an innocent person, and because you have shown absolutely no indication that you understand the gravity of what you have done." She picked up the sentencing document. "The law allows me significant discretion in sentencing for second-degree murder. I have considered the circumstances of this case, your complete lack of remorse, your history of violence, and the need to send a clear message that no one is above the law." Judge Carter's voice rang out clear and final. "It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you, Robert Harrison, be committed to the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections for a term of 40 years to life, with no possibility of parole for 40 years. The number hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Bob Harrison's face went white, his mouth opening soundlessly. 40 years? He finally gasped. That's a death sentence. Judge Carter looked at him without sympathy. Jamal Williams was 23 years old, Mr. Harrison. He will never be 24 or 30 or 48. He will never finish medical school, never treat patients, never get married, never have children, never grow old. You took all of that from him. So yes, you will spend the rest of your productive life in prison, and perhaps in those years you will finally develop the capacity for remorse that you have lacked until now. The gavel came down with a sound like finality itself, and Bob Harrison's composure shattered completely. "No!" he screamed, lunging to his feet, the bailiffs immediately restraining him. "This is bullshit! This is revenge! You're sentencing me because of your dead son!" He fought against the officers holding him, his face contorted with rage and desperation. Judge Carter watched him with an expression of perfect calm. "Justice is exactly what this is, Mr. Harrison. Justice for Jamal Williams, justice for his mother, justice for a community that is tired of seeing young black lives ended without accountability. Take him away." As the bailiffs dragged Bob Harrison toward the exit, his shouts echoing off the walls, Diane Williams sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her heart. Judge Carter met her eyes across the courtroom and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that carried the weight of shared grief and hard-won justice. When the door finally closed behind Bob Harrison, a collective breath seemed to release from everyone present. The trial was over. The sentence had been given. And while nothing could bring Jamal Williams back, there was at least this: accountability, consequence, justice.